The air in Mr. Finch's office was heavy with the scent of old paper, lemon polish, and grief. It had been a week since we buried my grandfather, Arthur Vance, and the four of us sat in stiff, high-backed chairs that felt more like pews. There was me, Clara Bishop, a 28-year-old archivist who preferred the company of dusty manuscripts to most people. There was my brother, Julian, 30, whose charisma was as bright and shallow as the screen of the phone he kept glancing at. And there was our mother, Eleanor, a woman whose beliefs had been forged in the 1970s and had remained hermetically sealed ever since. The fourth person was Mr. Alistair Finch, my grandfather's lawyer for 40 years, a man who looked as if he were carved from the same ancient wood as his desk. He cleared his throat, the sound rustling the silence. "We are gathered to read the last will and testament of Arthur Vance," he began, his voice dry as parchment. "I will dispense with the usual legal preamble, as Arthur found it dreadfully boring." He donned a pair of reading glasses and unfolded the document. My grandfather had been the patriarch of our family, a self-made man who had built a small manufacturing business into a diversified portfolio of commercial real estate and investments. He was sharp, unsentimental, and the only person in my family who had ever truly seen me. He was the one who had encouraged my love of history, who had paid for my master's degree in archival science. "It is a straightforward document," Mr. Finch continued. "After a few minor bequests to staff and charities, the remainder of the Vance estate, including all liquid assets, stocks, bonds, and the property known as Blackwood Manor, is to be placed in a trust. The beneficiaries of this trust are to be his two grandchildren, Clara Bishop and Julian Bishop, in equal shares." I felt a subtle release of tension in my shoulders. 50-50. It was fair. It was what I had expected. Julian shot me a quick, triumphant smile, as if we had just won a game. But then Mr. Finch read the next line, the line that would detonate my life. "The executor of this trust, tasked with distributing the funds and assets as she sees fit for the continued prosperity of the family, is to be my daughter, Eleanor Bishop." My mother straightened her spine, a flicker of profound satisfaction in her eyes. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. She had always favored Julian. He was the charming son, the aspiring entrepreneur, the one who was going to carry the Vance name forward. I was the quiet, bookish daughter, a reliable but unexciting supporting character in the grand family drama. "Thank you, Alistair," my mother said, her voice smooth and firm. She turned her gaze from the lawyer to her children, to me. "Julian, as you know, is at a critical stage with his new startup. It requires a significant injection of capital to scale properly. It is the future of this family." "Mom," I started, but she held up a hand, silencing. Clara, dear," she said, her voice laced with a condescending pity that was far more painful than outright cruelty. "You have a good, stable job. It's wonderful that you have a passion. But your needs are simple." Then came the words, the family creed she had recited for years, the words that felt like a slap. "A woman doesn't need a fortune. A woman needs a good husband and a secure home. The burdens of finance are best left to men." Julian had the grace to look momentarily uncomfortable, but he quickly masked it with an expression of earnest sincerity. "Clara, this will benefit all of us in the long run," he said, as if explaining a complex concept to a child. "Once my company takes off, I'll see you're taken care of, I promise." My throat felt tight, my voice a stranger in my own ears. "So, what are you saying?" My mother's gaze was unflinching. "I am exercising my discretion as executor. The entirety of the trust's liquid assets and investment portfolio will be transferred to Julian's company. Blackwood Manor will remain in the trust for the time being for my use." For you, Clara, I have allocated a sum of $50,000 to put toward a down payment on a nice apartment, perhaps $50,000. Out of an estate worth tens of millions, it wasn't the number that hurt. It was the casual dismissal, the pronouncement that my worth, my future, my security was a fraction of my brother's. That my role was to be taken care of, while his was to build an empire. I looked at my brother, the golden boy, so willing to accept a gift that was half mine. I looked at my mother, so certain in her outdated, suffocating beliefs. The betrayal was so profound, so absolute, it left me breathless. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. The archivist in me took over, cataloging the moment, filing it away under irrevocable loss. I see. I said, my voice dangerously calm. Thank you for clarifying. I walked out of the office, leaving the three of them to divide my future. I retreated to my small apartment, a sanctuary filled with the quiet, loyal company of old books. I let the grief for my grandfather mix with the hot, silent fury I felt toward my family. For 3 days, I heard nothing. I was in exile, written out of my own story. Then, on the 4th day, my phone rang. It was Mr. Finch. Miss Bishop, he said, his voice quiet and formal. I wonder if you might have a moment to spare. There is another matter concerning your grandfather's estate that we need to discuss in private. A flicker of something, not hope, but curiosity stirred in. And me, another matter? Indeed, he said. Arthur was a meticulous man. He believed in planning for every contingency. There was a pause. Every contingency. Could you meet me at my office tomorrow at 10? The next morning, I returned to the office that had been the site of my humiliation. This time, the air felt different, expectant. Mr. Finch greeted me not with a somber expression, but with a look of shrewd, quiet anticipation. He led me into a smaller, private study, not the main conference room. Clara, he said, dropping the formal Miss Bishop. Your grandfather was my client, but he was also my friend. He was a brilliant man. And he was not blind. He knew his daughter's traditionalist views, and he knew his grandson's appetites. He unlocked a drawer in his desk and retrieved a single thick envelope sealed with my grandfather's wax signet ring. My heart began to beat a little faster. Your grandfather prepared 2 documents, Mr. Finch explained. The first was his will, which we read the other day. The second was this letter, to be opened by you, and only you, in the event that the discretionary clause of the will was invoked in the manner that it was. He slid the envelope across the desk. My hands trembled slightly as I broke the seal. Inside was a letter, written in my grandfather's familiar, strong handwriting. My dearest Clara, if you are reading this, then your mother has done exactly as I predicted. She has let her antiquated notions cloud her judgment and has, in effect, disinherited you in favor of your brother. I am sorry for the pain this has surely caused you, but I am not sorry for what is to come, for this was not just a betrayal. It was a test, and your mother and brother have failed it spectacularly. The will we read was a piece of theater, my dear, a carefully constructed trap. I could not legally prevent your mother from acting as executor, but I could and did render her power meaningless. Truth of your inheritance is not in that will. It is in the corporate structuring I have spent the last decade arranging. The Vance estate that your mother so generously gifted to Julian consists of a single checking account and a modest investment portfolio. It is a handsome sum, to be sure, enough to allow Julian to play the brilliant entrepreneur for a year or 2 before he inevitably burns through it. It is his golden parachute and his golden cage. Your inheritance, Clara, is something else. Entirely. It is the foundation. Mr. Finch slid a thick portfolio across the desk as I continued to read. You are now the sole owner of a holding company I established 5 years ago. The Bishop Group. This company holds the true assets, the controlling shares of my original manufacturing firm, the deeds to the 12 commercial properties that generate the bulk of our family's passive income, the primary multi-million-dollar investment accounts, and as of the moment of my death, the deed to Blackwood Manor itself. My breath hitched. I looked up at Mr. Finch, my eyes wide. He nodded slowly, a small, grim smile on his face. Your mother is currently living in your house, Clara. The letter continued. The family trust she controls has been rendered a minor subsidiary of your holding company. The allowance she receives is now at your discretion. Julian's startup, I believe, operates out of one of our commercial buildings on Water Street. The lease agreement for that property is now held by you. You are, in effect, his landlady. I have done this not to be cruel, but to be just. I know you, Clara. You have a historian's patience and an archivist's attention to detail. You understand the value of preservation. You will not squander this legacy. You will protect it. You will make it grow. Your mother believes a woman doesn't need a fortune. Perhaps she is right. She needs something more. She needs power. She needs independence. And she needs the wisdom to wield them correctly. You have all three. This is your birthright, not the money. The control. Go on, my girl. Show them what a woman can do. With all my love. Grandfather, I finished the letter, my vision blurred by tears. They were not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming, vindicating gratitude. My grandfather hadn't just left me money. He had left me a fortress. He had left me a sword and a shield. He had left me his trust, the one thing my mother and brother had so carelessly thrown away. I looked up at Mr. Finch, the portfolio of deeds and stock certificates before me. The weight of it all was immense. This wasn't just wealth. It was a responsibility, a legacy. What do I do now? I whispered. Mr. Finch leaned forward, his eyes glinting. Now, my dear Clara, he said, a wolfish smile spreading across his face. We draft some letters. One to your mother, informing her of the change in ownership of her residence, and one to your brother. I believe his rent is past due. The fallout was swifter and more satisfying than I could have imagined. Mr. Finch, with the undisguised glee of a man executing a long-held plan, sent the official notices via courier. The first was to my mother. It was a polite, legally airtight letter informing her that ownership of Blackwood Manor had been transferred to the Bishop Group, of which I was the sole director. It informed her that the household staff and accounts would now be managed by my office, and that her living expenses would be provided for via a generous but fixed monthly stipend, the terms of which were at my discretion. In essence, she had become a tenant in her own home, her allowance controlled by the daughter she had deemed unworthy of a fortune. The second letter was to Julian. It was a standard commercial landlord notice informing him that the rent for his trendy downtown office space, which he had been living in rent-free under the guise of a family subsidy, was now due, effective the first of the month. Furthermore, it was to be adjusted to the current and rather steep market rate. Their reaction was not long in coming. They arrived at Blackwood Manor that evening, storming in without knocking. They found me not in the formal living room, but in the library, my grandfather's favorite room. I was sitting in his large leather armchair, a cup of tea on the table beside me, a rare 18th century manuscript open in my lap. For the first time in my life, I felt perfectly at home there. What is the meaning of this, Clara? My mother demanded, waving the letter in her hand. Her face was pale with shock and fury. Julian was right behind her, his usual confident smirk replaced by a look of panicked disbelief. This is insane. It's theft. Finch is trying to steal my funding. I carefully placed a bookmark in my manuscript and set it aside. I looked up at them, my expression calm. I felt no need to raise my voice. The power in the room was quietly, immovably mine. "It's not theft, Julian," I said calmly. "It's business, grandfather's business. As for your funding, you have it. The money from the trust is yours. Grandfather was very specific about that. You are free to do with it as you please. You will, however, have to start paying your own bills, my bills," he sputtered. "The rent on that office is astronomical. It'll eat up half my capital." "Then perhaps you should find a cheaper office," I suggested. "Or develop a business model that can support its own overhead. That's what real entrepreneurs do." He stared at me, speechless. He had never been spoken to this way. He turned to our mother for support, but she was focused entirely on me, a dawning horror in her eyes as she finally began to understand the scale of her miscalculation. "The house. Clara," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "This house belongs to the family." "Yes," I agreed. "And as grandfather's chosen heir, I am the head of the family now. And I am telling you that you are welcome to live here, Mother. This will always be a home for you." "But it is. My home, the deeds, the accounts, the decisions. They are mine. Grandfather saw to that." I stood up and walked over to the large globe by the window, the same one from my portrait. I gave it a slow spin. "You told me that a woman doesn't need a fortune," I said, my voice soft but carrying across the silent room. I turned to face them, my gaze meeting my mother's. "You were right, in a way. I don't need one." I smiled, a small, sad but resolute smile. "I was entrusted with one, and I will not let it be squandered on foolish ideas or foolish men." My mother crumpled into a nearby chair, the fight draining out of her. Julian just stood there, his dreams of easy success turning to ash in his mouth. They had walked in expecting to intimidate me, to bully me back into my designated place as the quiet, overlooked daughter. They had found, instead, my grandfather's successor. I didn't throw them out. I didn't cut them off. That would have been their kind of move, an emotional, punitive act. I did as my grandfather would have. I was simply correct. I maintained my mother's stipend, enough for her to live comfortably but not extravagantly. I enforced Julian's lease. His startup, deprived of its endless, unearned river of cash, folded within 6 months. He was forced, for the first time in his life, to get a job. I, on the other hand, thrived. I hired a skilled management team to oversee the family businesses, but I took a personal interest in the archives of my grandfather's company, unearthing old plans and forgotten assets that added new value to the portfolio. I began a careful, loving restoration of Blackwood Manor. Sometimes, in the evenings, my mother and I would sit in the library. We didn't talk about the inheritance. We didn't talk about the past, but there was a new grudging respect in her eyes, a slow, dawning understanding that the world she had prepared me for no longer existed, and that the granddaughter she had underestimated was now the formidable woman holding their world together. My grandfather had given me more than a fortune. He had given me the chance to prove my own worth on my own terms, and in the quiet, resolute power I now wielded, I honored his memory every single day. The first anniversary of my grandfather's passing arrived with a quiet fall of snow, blanketing the grounds of Blackwood Manor in a pristine, silent white. In the year that had passed, a new order had settled over our lives. Julian, after his startup imploded, had taken a sales job with a tech firm, a humbling but necessary dose of reality. My mother remained at the manor, a quiet and diminished presence. The fire of her conviction had been banked, leaving behind the cool embers of a life she no longer understood. We coexisted, 2 planets in a shared orbit, held in place by the gravitational pull of the house and the memory of the man who had set our courses. I have found my rhythm not in boardrooms, but here in the library. While I had a capable team managing the portfolio, my true work was with the past. I was a custodian of my grandfather's legacy, and I treated his life as my ultimate archival project. I was organizing his papers, his journals, his entire history dotted. Was during this process in a dusty crate marked personal effects that I found it. It wasn't a stock certificate or a deed. It was a small leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth with time. The handwriting inside was not my grandfather's bold, decisive script. It was a fluid, elegant cursive I didn't recognize. A faded inscription on the inside cover read, Eleanor Vance, her thoughts, 1958. My grandmother. A woman I barely remembered, a quiet figure who had passed away when I was a child. The family narrative held that she was a wonderful homemaker, a supportive wife to her brilliant, self-made husband. This journal told a different story. It was filled with sharp, insightful observations about business. There were detailed notes on supply chain logistics, brilliant ideas for product diversification, and shrewd assessments of market competitors. I found a passage describing the night she and my grandfather, then a young, struggling couple, decided to risk everything they had to buy their first piece of machinery. The idea, the risk, the strategy, it had been hers. I kept reading, my heart pounding with the force of a discovery that was rewriting history. My grandmother hadn't just been a supportive wife. She had been a co-founder, a silent partner whose contributions over time had been absorbed into the myth of the loan. Male genius. I closed the journal, my mind reeling. I understood my grandfather so much more clearly now. His fierce determination to put power in my hands wasn't just about empowering his granddaughter, it was about honoring his wife. He was righting a historical wrong, ensuring that the legacy she had helped build would pass to a woman capable of stewarding it. And my mother had built her entire worldview on a lie, modeling her life after a pale imitation of a woman she never truly knew. I found her in the conservatory, staring out at the snow-covered gardens. I walked in, holding the journal. I found something of grandmother's, I said softly. She turned, her expression guarded. What is it? Her journal, I said. I sat opposite her and opened it to a specific page. Listen to this. Arthur worries about the loan. He sees only the debt. I see the foundation. If we can secure the timber contract from the North County, we can undercut the competition by a full quarter. The risk is not in the borrowing. The risk is in not being bold enough to try. My mother stared at me, her brow furrowed in confusion. That sounds like father. It was written by Eleonora, I said gently, in 1959, the year before they launched the company. I passed the journal to her. She took it, her fingers tracing the worn leather. She read the passage then. Another and another. I watched as 50 years of bedrock belief began to fracture. The story she had clung to of the powerful provider husband and the quiet, supportive wife was dissolving in her hands, replaced by a truth that was far more complex and brilliant. She looked up from the journal, her eyes filled with a dawning, painful understanding. It wasn't about me and her anymore. It was about her and her own mother. He never told me, she whispered, her voice thick with a strange new grief. All these years I thought I was honoring her by being what she was. You were, I said, my voice softer than I thought possible. You were honoring the woman everyone saw, but he wanted me to be the woman he knew. In that moment, the power dynamic between us vanished. We were no longer victor and vanquished, landlady and tenant. We were two women, a daughter and a granddaughter, finally meeting the matriarch whose ghost had shaped our lives in ways we were only just beginning to comprehend. She didn't apologize. The word would have been too small for the vastness of the Revelation. Instead, she reached across the table and placed her hand on the journal, her fingers resting next to mine. It was the first time she had willingly touched me in over a year. A fragile bridge was built in that quiet, snowy room. Not of forgiveness, but of a shared, complicated truth. My grandfather had left me a fortune and a business and a house. But his final, most precious gift was this, the truth of the past. And in sharing it, I hadn't just secured my own future. I had given my mother back a piece of her own. 6 months slid by, and the quiet rhythm of our new reality at Blackwood Manor felt less like a tense armistice and more like a fragile, established peace. My mother, Eleanor, had taken to spending her afternoons in the library with me. She wouldn't read her mother's journals again, but she would sit with me as I worked, a silent companion watching me piece together our family's true history. It was her way of paying respect to the woman she'd never known and the daughter. She was only just beginning to dot. My focus had become Vance Manufacturing, the cornerstone of the empire. I found I had a knack for it, a talent inherited not just from my grandfather, but from the grandmother whose legacy I was unearthing. I used my archivist's mind to dig through old company records, finding forgotten patents and undervalued assets. I wasn't just a custodian, I was a builder. The board, initially wary of my age and gender, had been won over by results. For the first time, I felt the satisfying heft of my own competence, earned and proven. The call that shattered the peace came from Mr. Finch during a quarterly board meeting. His voice, usually so measured, was tight with urgency. "Clara, we have a problem," he said, dispensing with formalities. "A serious one. Apex Consolidated has initiated a hostile takeover bid. Apex was our oldest and most ruthless competitor." The room went silent. The board members exchanged worried glances. A hostile takeover was a bloody, expensive battle. One that could tear the company apart? How? I asked, my mind already racing. Our financials are strong. Our stock is stable. They don't have the leverage. They seem to be exceptionally well informed, Mr. Finch said grimly. They're targeting 2 of our smaller international divisions, exploiting a loophole in their incorporation that makes them vulnerable. They're approaching our institutional investors with a very specific, very tempting offer. It's a surgical strike, Clara. They know exactly where our weak points are. There was only one person outside this room who would have that kind of specific, albeit superficial, knowledge of our company's structure. One person bitter enough and foolish enough to sell his family's secrets for a chance at revenge. My blood ran cold. Julian. It took my private security team less than a day to confirm it. Apex Consolidated had hired a new strategic consultant a month prior. My brother, in a final, desperate act of spite, had armed our enemies and pointed them at our hurt. He couldn't have the kingdom, so he was going to help someone else burn it down. The news hit my mother harder than anything that had come before. The revelation of her own mother's history had humbled her. The revelation of her son's treachery broke her. "I did this," she whispered, her face ashen. "My foolishness. It created a monster. I had no time for pity or anger. I had a company to save. I called Julian." He answered on the second ring, his voice smug and defiant. "To what do I owe the pleasure, sis?" He sneered. "I know what you did, Julian," I said. My voice is cold and clear as ice. "I'm just a consultant." He shot back. "It's business, a concept you're supposed to be so good at." They made me an offer. Something about my deep institutional knowledge. "Turns out my name is still worth something, even if you aren't. The company will fight this," I said. "You will gain nothing." He laughed, a bitter, ugly sound. "I've already won, Clara. Win or lose, Apex is paying me a fortune. And I get to sit back and watch them tear down everything you think you own. Maybe Mom was right. Maybe a woman can't handle a fortune after all." He hung up. The gauntlet had been thrown. He believed he had dealt a killing blow. But he had made the same mistake our mother had. He had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of my power. It wasn't just in the deeds and stock certificates. It was in the archives. For 2 days, I locked myself in the library. I didn't look at market reports or legal strategies. I went back to the source. I went through my grandfather's and grandmother's original corporate filings from the 1950s and 60s. I pored over charter documents, bylaws, and minutes from the earliest board meetings. Julian had given Apex a map of the modern company, but I was looking for the secrets buried in its foundation. I found it on the second night. A single folded sheet of paper tucked inside my grandmother's journal. It was an addendum to the original company charter dated 1961. It was drafted in dense legalese, but its purpose was clear. It was a poison pill, a defense mechanism of pure genius, designed to protect the family business from exactly this kind of threat. My grandmother, it seemed, had been worried about corporate raiders even then. The clause, which they had named the Eleonora Mandate, stated that in the event of a hostile takeover attempt by any competitor, all shares held within the family, trust my shares, would automatically be granted tenfold voting rights. It made any outside attempt to seize a controlling interest mathematically impossible. It was a brilliant, unbreakable defense, and it had been forgotten for 60 years. The emergency shareholder meeting was held in a tense-packed auditorium. The CEO of Apex, a slick corporate predator named Marcus Thorne, no relation, laid out his offer. Julian sat behind him, a triumphant smirk on his face. My board members looked grim. The institutional investors looked tempted. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't walk to the podium with a counteroffer. I walked up with a single yellowed sheet of paper. "Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Thorne," I began, my voice clear and steady, amplified by the microphone. "It's a bold plan. Unfortunately, it is also predicated on a fundamental misunderstanding of the company you are trying to acquire. I address the shareholders. What my brother, in his role as consultant, failed to inform you of is a unique feature of our company's founding charter." I held up the document. "I'd like to introduce you all to the Eleonora Mandate of 1961. I explained the clause. A ripple of shock went through the room. Lawyers started whispering furiously to each other. The Apex CEO's face went from confident to confused to a deep, apoplectic red. The takeover wasn't just difficult, it was impossible. His surgical strike had hit a wall of titanium. I turned my gaze to my brother. His smirk had vanished, replaced by the same look of pale, panicked disbelief I had seen in my mother's face a year ago. He was watching his last, best hope for revenge evaporate. Into thin air. The meeting ended in disarray. The Apex bid was withdrawn before lunch. The last I heard, Julian was unceremoniously fired and escorted from their building. He had nothing left. No family trust, no job, no prospects. He was just a man who had betrayed everyone for nothing. That evening, I stood in the quiet boardroom of Vance Manufacturing. On the wall, where a generic corporate landscape painting used to hang, there was now a newly commissioned portrait of my grandmother, Eleonora Vance, based on an old photograph I had found. She looked sharp, intelligent, and formidable. My phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice was quiet, heavy with an emotion I had never heard from her before. "Mr. Finch told me what happened," she said. "What Julian did, and what you did." She paused. "I am so sorry, Clara, not for the inheritance. For him, I am sorry for what I raised him to be." "I know, Mom," I said. "And I did. Your grandfather would be proud," she said. "Your grandmother would be too." After she hung up, I walked over to the portrait. I had not only saved the company, I had saved it using the wisdom and foresight of the woman who had been written out of its story. I had not only honored my grandfather's wishes, I had honored his partner. The legacy was finally whole. And it was safe. The silence left in the wake of Julian's final failed gambit was profound. It was more than the absence of conflict. It was the stillness of a battlefield after the last echo of cannon fire has faded. For the first time, there were no more threats to anticipate, no more betrayals to guard against. There was only the future, a vast, open territory waiting to be mapped, that my life settled into a new, demanding rhythm. I divided my time between the company headquarters downtown and the quiet, scholarly refuge of the Blackwood Manor Library. At Advanced Manufacturing, I found a surprising passion for the work. My archival mind was uniquely suited to seeing the company not as a series of quarterly reports, but as a living history, a complex organism with a past that informed its future. I championed a new R&D division, funding it by trimming the fat from vanity projects Julian had once championed. I established a new employee profit-sharing plan, arguing to the board that the company's foundation was its people, a lesson gleaned from my grandmother's journal, where she spoke of the factory workers by name. At home, my relationship with my mother continued its slow, cautious evolution. The truth about her own mother had shattered the rigid framework of her world, and she was slowly, hesitantly, piecing together a new one. She started asking questions about Eleonora, not just as a business partner, but as a person. Together, we went through old photo albums and boxes of letters, reconstructing the woman who had been erased. In sharing our family's history, we began, for the first time, to build a new one of our own. One evening, I found her standing in the boardroom, which I now used as my home office. She was looking at the portrait of Eleonora. She looked so capable, my mother said, her voice filled with a quiet awe. She was, I confirmed. All those years, she said, more to herself than to me, I told you that you should find a strong man to rely on. It seems the strongest person in this family was a woman all along. I just couldn't see it. She turned to me, her eyes clear. I'm glad you didn't listen to me, Clara. It was the closest she had ever come to an apology, and it was more than enough. The first year bled into the second. The company thrived. The manor, under my careful attention, began to feel less like a museum and more like a home. But I knew something was missing. My grandfather hadn't just left me a legacy to protect. He had left me a platform. The story of Eleonora Vance felt like a secret I had a duty to share. The idea came to me in the library, surrounded by the stories of the past. I would create a new story for the future. The Eleonora Vance Initiative was born. It wasn't a charity. It was a venture capital fund with a singular mission: to provide seed money and mentorship to female entrepreneurs, specifically those in manufacturing, tech, and design, the very fields my grandmother had influenced. I would use the family fortune to fund the next generation of Eleonoras, women with bold ideas who were told they needed to be quiet, to be supportive, to let a man lead. The launch event was the first party I had ever hosted at Blackwood Manor. The house was filled with light and life, with ambitious, brilliant women, grizzled board members, and city leaders. I stood at a podium in the grand ballroom and told my grandmother's story. I didn't mention the family strife. I simply told the truth of a woman who had been a silent partner in building an empire, and I dedicated the future of that empire to ensuring no other woman's contributions would be silenced again. My mother sat in the front row, her applause the loudest in the room. Life had a new purpose. My days were filled with business plans and pitch meetings, with the thrilling energy of new ideas. I found I was a shrewd judge of character and a good steward of my grandfather's faith in me. The final loose thread of my old life was Julian. I had not spoken to him since the failed takeover. I had made a conscious decision to put him out of my mind. But Mr. Finch, ever the dutiful family lawyer, felt compelled to keep me informed. His severance from Apex was rescinded due to his fraudulent consultation. Mr. Finch told me one afternoon over tea. He burned through his remaining trust. Fund money in 3 months. He lost his apartment. He's working as a bartender at a club downtown. I felt a pang of something. Not pity, but a deep, weary sadness. He had been given every advantage, every opportunity, and had squandered them all in the name of pride and spite. Is he asking for money? I asked. No, Mr. Finch said, a note of surprise in his voice. He has not made any inquiries. By all accounts, he has simply vanished into a life of anonymity. I was silent for a long time. My mother's voice echoed in my head. I am sorry for what I raised him to be. He was my brother. A toxic, destructive force in my life, but my brother nonetheless. Leaving him to completely self-destruct felt like a failure of my own, a final surrender to the bitterness he had sown. Alistair, I said, I want you to set up a new trust. A very small one. Anonymous. It will be managed by your office. I want it to pay the rent on a modest 1-bedroom apartment for him. Nothing more, no cash, no allowance. Just a roof over his head. He can sink or swim on his own merits, but he will not be homeless. Mr. Finch looked at me, his expression unreadable. That is a very generous gesture, Clara. Some might say an undeserved one. It's not for him, I said. It's for me and for grandfather. The legacy is about building things, not letting them fall into ruin. This is just managing the last damaged asset. It was a final act of detachment. A way to close the book on Julian without tearing out the page entirely. That evening, I was walking through the gardens with Ben Carter, an architectural historian from the university whom I had hired to consult on the manor's restoration. He was a kind, brilliant man with a quick laugh and eyes that saw the history in every stone and pane of glass. He was the first person I had met who seemed utterly unimpressed by my wealth, but endlessly fascinated by my mind. We were looking at the old, dilapidated greenhouse at the far end of the property. This structure is fascinating, Ben said, running a hand over the rusted iron framework. The design is far more advanced than the main house. It suggests a mind that was interested in engineering and light and growth. I smiled. It was my grandmother's, I said. She designed it herself. It was her private laboratory. He looked from the greenhouse to me, a look of deep understanding on his face. Of course it was. We stood there as the sun began to set, the sky turning a soft rose gold. The air was cool and crisp. We talked about cantilevered supports and historical preservation, our conversation in easy, comfortable rhythm. After a while, he fell silent, and I felt his hand gently take mine. It wasn't a gesture of possession or passion, but of simple, profound companionship. I looked at the strong, beautiful home before me, its windows glowing with warmth. I thought of the foundation I was funding, the family history I had restored, the quiet truce I had made with my past, and the gentle hand that was holding my own. My grandfather had left me a fortune, and my mother had tried to take it away. But what I had now was something neither of them could have ever conceived of. It wasn't just a legacy. It was a life. And it was entirely, completely my own dot, my deepest. Apologies for misinterpreting the scope of the project. I understand now that the goal is a longer, novel-length piece, and I was concluding the story prematurely based on its narrative arc rather than the intended word count. Thank you for the clear direction. I will add a substantial new part too. The story, expanding on the character's new reality and building out the world you've enjoyed. The quiet of Blackwood Manor was a living thing. For most of my life, It had been a silence of absence, of unspoken tensions and rooms that held more ghosts than memories. Now, after the storms had passed, it had become a silence of peace, of purpose. It was the sound of old wood settling, of pages turning in the library, of the wind whispering through the ancient oaks my grandfather had planted. It was the sound of home. My days took on a structure that was both demanding and deeply satisfying. Mornings were for Vance Manufacturing. I would drive downtown to the headquarters, a building that no longer felt intimidating, and immerse myself in the world my grandparents had built. The initial wariness from the board had given way to a solid, earned respect. They had seen me stare down a hostile takeover and win not with brute financial force, but with intelligence and a historian's cunning. They had learned, as I had, that the company's greatest asset was its history. I was no longer just Arthur Vance's granddaughter. I was Eleonora Vance's successor. Afternoons were for the Eleonora Vance Initiative. This was my true passion project, the soul of my new life. The Manor's ballroom, once a place of stuffy, infrequent gatherings, was now the foundation's headquarters. We had a small, dedicated staff, and the room buzzed with the energy of creation. My mother had surprised me by taking an active, if quiet, role. Her official title was Community Outreach Liaison, but her real role was that of a discerning, surprisingly insightful judge of character. Stripped of her old, rigid beliefs, she possessed a keen eye for sincerity and a deep suspicion of false bravado. She would sit in on the final round of interviews for our grants, her observations often proving more valuable than any financial projection. One crisp November afternoon, we were in the final deliberations for our inaugural flagship grant, substantial multi-year endowment that would be transformative for the recipient. We had narrowed it down to 2 candidates. The choice seems obvious to me, my mother said, looking over her notes. The proposal from Sterling Robotics is solid. They have a proven product, existing contracts, and a clear 5-year plan for expansion. It's a safe, steady investment. She was right. Sterling Robotics was the sensible choice. It was a company run by a competent, experienced woman who would undoubtedly use our money wisely and generate a respectable return, both financially and for the foundation's reputation. What do you think of Project Chimera? I asked, looking at the other file on the table. My mother sighed softly. Clara, dear, it's a beautiful idea. A noble one, but it's theoretical. This young woman, Dr. Iris Thorne, is brilliant, there's no doubt. But biodegradable micropolymers designed to combat oceanic plastic pollution? It's a dream. She has no factory, no staff, just the patent and a garage full of prototypes. I smiled. She has more than that. She has a vision that could change the world. She also has a 90% chance of failure, my mother countered, her voice gentle, not dismissive. This was our new dynamic, a respectful debate of ideas, not a clash of wills. Grandmother and grandfather had a 90% chance of failure when they bought their first piece of machinery with borrowed money, I replied. I opened Dr. Thorne's file. I spoke with her yesterday. She reminds me of the woman I read about in the journals. She sees the foundation, not the debt. She sees the future. My mother was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. She was learning to read the new lines of it, the ones etched by authority and purpose. You're going to give it to her, aren't you? I am, I confirmed. We'll give Sterling Robotics a smaller secondary grant. They'll do fine with or without us, but Dr. Thorne, women like her are the reason this foundation exists. We're not here to back sure things, Mother. We're here to be bold. She looked from me to the portrait of Eleonora that hung on the far wall. A slow, thoughtful smile touched her lips. Yes, she said, I suppose we are. That evening, the first real snow of the season began to fall. I was in the library, cataloging a new set of my grandfather's correspondence, when Mr. Finch was announced. He came in, shaking the snow from his overcoat, his cheeks rosy from the cold. "A chilly evening, Clara," he said, accepting the cup of tea I offered. "It's good to see you, Alistair. I assume this isn't just a social call." "No," he said, settling into the armchair by the fire. "It's about the final piece of business, the Julian Trust." I stiffened slightly. We had not spoken my brother's name in months. The anonymous trust I had established had been paying the rent on a small apartment across town, a silent, invisible safety net. "He hasn't missed a rent payment because we pay it directly," Mr. Finch reported. "He has held his job at the Monarch Club for 10 months. He is, by all accounts, living a quiet and unremarkable life. And," I prompted, knowing there was more, "he came to my office last week," the lawyer said. My hand tightened around my teacup. "He did not ask for me. He left a message with my receptionist for his anonymous benefactor." "What was the message?" Mr. Finch pulled a small notepad from his breast pocket and read the transcribed note aloud. It says, "Tell them it's the first time in my life I've ever earned my own roof. And tell them, thank you." The words hung in the warm, firelit air. They were simple, stripped of his usual charm and bluster. There was no way to know the true intent behind them, if it was sarcasm or resignation, or a tiny, hard one. Seed of genuine gratitude. But as I sat there, I realized it didn't matter. His journey was his own now. The thank you wasn't for me to accept or reject. It was for him to have said. The final thread of responsibility I felt for him dissolved. He was no longer my problem to solve or my burden to carry. He was just a man I used to know. "Thank you for telling me, Alistair," I said. The book on Julian Bishop was finally, irrevocably closed out. My focus turned more and more to the manor itself, specifically to the dilapidated greenhouse my grandmother had designed. It was my link to her, a physical manifestation of her hidden genius. Ben Carter, the architectural historian, had become a regular presence at Blackwood, his passion for the project matching my own. The restoration was a painstaking process, an act of historical and architectural archaeology. We spent weeks in the library, poring over Eleonora's original sketches and notes. We discovered she had designed a passive solar heating system and a rainwater reclamation cistern that were decades ahead of their time. Ben was ecstatic, marveling at her ingenuity. She wasn't just a businesswoman. "Clara," he'd said one afternoon, his face smudged with dust as we examined the crumbling foundation. "She was an engineer, a visionary. This wasn't just a greenhouse. It was a prototype for sustainable living." Our relationship grew as the greenhouse was reborn. It was a slow, quiet courtship conducted over blueprints and historical documents. We talked about architectural theory, about the way buildings hold the stories of the people who live in them. He was the first person who saw Blackwood Manor, not as a symbol of wealth, but as a document to be read, a history to be honored. He saw me in the same way. One afternoon, as the restoration was nearing completion, we were inside the now glorious structure. The new panes of glass gleamed, the intricate ironwork restored to its former glory. We had managed to salvage and repair the original cistern system. "We found something," Ben said, his eyes alight with excitement. In the base of the main cistern, it was sealed. He led me to a corner where 2 workmen were carefully prying a loose stone from the foundation. Behind it was a small lead-lined box, tarnished with age. They lifted it out and set it on a workbench. "It was heavy. It wasn't on any of the plans," Ben said. "It feels like a time capsule," my heart hammered. With Ben's help, I pried open the lid. Inside, protected from the elements, was not a collection of trinkets, but another journal. smaller than the first, bound in dark green leather, and beside it a series of stunningly detailed botanical drawings of orchids, each one annotated in Eleonora's elegant script. This journal was different. It wasn't about business. It was deeply personal. It spoke of her love for my grandfather, her frustrations with the societal roles that limited her, and her dreams for the future. But mostly, it spoke of her orchids. She had been a passionate hybridizer, creating new species, a secret, creative life she had pursued in this glass sanctuary. And then I saw the final entry, dated just a few months before she passed away. "I have perfected the Eleonora Vance orchid," she wrote. "A hybrid of unparalleled resilience and delicate beauty. It can survive a frost and still bloom. I have left the seeds in this box. My hope is that someday a daughter of this house will find them. A woman who understands that true strength is not the absence of fragility, but the ability to bloom in spite of it. May she cultivate a garden of her own." Tears streamed down my face as I read the words. It was a message sent across time from one woman of the house to another. A final. Inheritance.Ben stood beside me, his hand resting gently on my shoulder. He didn't speak. He simply stood witness, understanding the magnitude of the moment. The discovery wasn't just about the past. It was a directive for the future. That evening, Ben and I walked through the finished greenhouse. The air was warm and humid, filled with the scent of damp earth and possibility. We had planted the first of the heirloom seeds in a place of honor. She was incredible, he said softly, looking at the empty pots waiting to bloom. "Yes," I said, "she was." We stopped in the center of the greenhouse, the setting sun, casting long, golden rays through the glass. "You know," he said, turning to face me, "all this time, I thought we were just restoring a building." He reached out and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from my face. "But we were really just cultivating a garden for its rightful owner to return to." In the quiet warmth of the greenhouse, surrounded by the legacy of my grandmother and the promise of a future I was building myself, he leaned in and kissed me. It was a kiss that tasted of hope, of companionship, of a home finally, truly found. The fortune, the power, the company, they were all just tools. The real inheritance was this, the chance to plant a garden of my own and to watch it bloom. The library at Blackwood Manor smells of old leather, beeswax, and wood smoke from the crackling fire. Outside, a riot of gold and crimson leaves falls from the ancient oaks, blanketing the grounds in a final brilliant display before the quiet of winter. It has been 5 years since the Apex Consolidated takeover failed. 5 years since the last ghost of my old life was truly laid to rest. I often find myself here in the evenings, not necessarily to work, but to sit in the stillness and reflect on the nature of an inheritance. I have come to understand that it is not a gift given at the end of a life, but a story that is passed from one generation to the next. Waiting for its new author, the Eleonora Vance Initiative has become my life's most meaningful work. The ballroom, once a silent, cavernous space, is now a hub of constant, farming energy. We have funded over 30 businesses, all founded and led by women whose ideas were too bold, too unconventional for traditional capital. Our greatest triumph remains our first. Dr. Eris Thorne, the brilliant biologist my mother once worried was too much of a dreamer, is no longer working out of a garage. Her company, Chimera Bioplastics, now operates out of a state-of-the-art facility, a repurposed Vance manufacturing plant. I sold her for $1 and has successfully deployed its biodegradable micropolymers in 3 targeted zones in the Pacific. News reports show satellite images of the massive plastic gyres slowly shrinking, being devoured by the microscopic life she engineered. She is changing the world, and we had the privilege of opening the first door for her. My mother is the soul of the initiative. The transformation in her has been the most profound and unexpected gift of these last few years. The rigid certainty that once defined her has been replaced by a quiet, powerful empathy. She has become the foundation's de facto mentor in residence. She spends her afternoons meeting with our new candidates, not to scrutinize their business plans, but to listen to their stories. She has an uncanny ability to see the person behind the pitch, to sense the grit and resilience beneath the nervous exterior. Just last week, I watched her with a young woman, a software engineer who had developed a new AI-driven literacy program for disadvantaged children. The young woman was nervous, her presentation faltering. My mother didn't interrupt. She simply waited until the end, then closed the file and said, "Forget the projections for a moment, dear. Tell me about the first child you helped." The woman's face lit up, and she spoke for 20 minutes with a passion and clarity that had been buried under her anxiety. Later, my mother came to me. "That one, Clara," she said with absolute certainty. "She has the heart for it. The rest is just details." She has found a new purpose, not as a matriarch enforcing old rules, but as one nurturing new beginnings. We have, in our own way, become partners. Vance Manufacturing continues to be a bastion of stability and quiet innovation. I remain as chair of the board, but I have entrusted the day-to-day operations to a CAO I hired from within, a woman who started on the factory floor 30 years ago. My role now is that of a historian and strategist, using the deep archives to guide our future. We recently revived a dormant patent of my grandfather's for a lightweight metal alloy, which, when combined with modern techniques, has revolutionized our aerospace division. The past, I've learned, is not a static place. It is a library of forgotten solutions, waiting for the right question to be asked. The most profound changes, however, have been here, within the walls of Blackwood Manor. The house is no longer a silent museum. It is a home. Ben and I were married 2 years ago, a small ceremony in the newly restored gardens. Our life together is a comfortable, ongoing conversation about history, architecture, and the future. He is now a tenured professor at the university, and his seminars on historical preservation are held here in the Manor's library, where students can learn amongst the primary sources themselves. The greenhouse, Eleonora's greenhouse, is my sanctuary. It is a stunning cathedral of glass and steel, filled with the impossible, breathtaking beauty of her orchids. After years of patient cultivation, we succeeded in germinating the seeds she left behind. The Eleonora Vance orchid is a marvella, delicate, star-shaped flower with petals the color of a winter twilight, yet it is hardy enough to withstand the sudden frost. It is, I think, a perfect metaphor for the woman who created it. Ben and I often spend our evenings there, the warm, humid air a welcome contrast to the New England chill. It was there, a few nights ago, that he told me Mr. Finch had called him. It was about Julian Dodd. There had been no contact for 5 years. The anonymous trust paid his rent, and that was the only connection. According to Alistair, Julian had stayed at the bartending job for 2 years before moving to a logistics position at a shipping company, a low-level management role. He had stayed there for 3 years. He had been promoted twice. He lived in the same modest apartment. He had, against all odds, achieved a life of quiet stability. The message Ben relayed was that Julian had, for the first time, asked for the trust to be dissolved. He was taking over the rent himself. He no longer needed the safety net. I felt no triumph, no vindication. I felt only a distant sense of closure, like an archivist filing away the final folder of a long and complicated collection. His story was now his own to write, and it no longer had any bearing on mine. The debt was paid, the book was closed dot, so now I sit here in my grandfather's chair, in my grandmother's library. I am surrounded by their legacy, a legacy I once thought was only about money and power. I see now that it was always about something more. It was about resilience. It was about foresight. It was about the quiet, unshakable belief that a person's worth is not defined by their gender or their role, but by their character and their vision. Then comes in and places a hand on my shoulder. "Everything okay?" he asks. I look up from this journal and smile, a genuine, uncomplicated smile of pure contentment. Everything is perfect. I close the book. The fire crackles. Outside, the snow falls softly on the gardens my grandmother designed, on the house my grandfather built, on the future we are all creating together. The inheritance is at last complete. A cool breeze, smelling of night-blooming jasmine and the distant electric tang of Manila washed over us. It felt like a cleansing, a rinsing away of the stale, recycled air of that hall, thick with lies and cheap perfume. "The transfer is complete," I said, looking down at the screen of my phone before slipping it back into my clutch. The number was substantial, but it felt like the best money I had ever spent. It was the price of truth. Mara gave a slight nod, her own phone vibrating in her suit pocket, no doubt with the confirmation. "A pleasure doing business with you, Kira," she said. Her use of my first name was the only breach of her professional. Armor all might, she turned to leave, but paused. "You know," she said, her voice thoughtful, clinical. "In my field, we study the effects of chemical compounds, how they can alter perception, induce euphoria, or become toxic with overuse." She looked back toward the grand mansion, where the muffled sound of a woman screaming my mother, I guessed, had begun. Sympathy is much the same. In small, genuine doses, it's a balm. But for some personalities, like your sister's, it becomes a highly addictive, psychoactive substance. They can't live without it. The withdrawal is dramatic. "I counted on that," I said. She gave a thin, appreciative smile. "Yes, you did." And with that, she turned and walked down the marble steps with the same unhurried confidence with which she had entered. A black car, which must have been waiting for her, pulled away from the curb, its headlights cutting a swath through the darkness before it rounded a corner and was gone. And then I was alone. The silence she left behind was immense. The night felt vast around me. For 5 years, my life had been a singular, pointed mission. Every decision, every dollar saved, every feigned symptom was a step on the path to this exact evening. The project was complete, the data was published, and now there was nothing, just the quiet hum of a city that didn't know or care about the lives I had just shattered, including in a way my own. I walked away from the mansion, not looking back. I followed a stone path that wound through the meticulously manicured gardens. The scent of jasmine was cloying, too sweet. I found a small, iron bench tucked away in an alcove of hibiscus bush, overlooking Lower Terrace. From here, the mansion was still visible, a monolith of light and disaster, but the sounds were muted, distant. I sat down, the cold iron a shock through the thin fabric of my dress. I replayed the scene. Damien's face, crumbling from pride to humiliation to fury. My father's booming rage turning to ashen disbelief. My mother's brittle social grace cracking into a million pieces. And Serafina, on the floor, a puddle of spoiled lace and performative hysterics. It was everything I had planned for, everything I had envisioned. I felt no remorse. I felt no guilt. To feel guilt would be to suggest they didn't deserve it. They did. They had chosen their parts in the theater of my slow death. My father, the stoic patriarch. My mother, the grieving matriarch. And Serafina, the tragic, sainted sister. They loved their roles. They had auditions and rehearsals every time they spoke to their friends, every time they looked at me with those pitying eyes. I had simply ended the production. My mind drifted back, not to the recent years of planning, but further, to the root of it all. People would call my revenge disproportionate. They wouldn't understand that the fake illness wasn't the cause. It was just the final, most audacious symptom of a disease that had been poisoning our family my entire life, Seraphine's. Pathological need to be the sun around which all other planets orbited. I was 14. I'd had a severe case of pneumonia, the kind that settles deep in your lungs and makes every breath feel like you're inhaling shards of glass. I was hospitalized for a week. It was real, genuine sickness, the kind that frightens a child. My parents were worried, attentive. For that 1 week, I was the center of their concern. I was the one who needed them. Serafina, then 16, visited once. She didn't bring a book or a magazine. She brought a mirror, a small silver hand mirror from her vanity. "I thought you'd want to see what you look like," she'd said. Her voice bright and cheerful. I thought she was being kind. I took the mirror. My face was pale, sweaty. My hair was matted. Dark circles like bruises bloomed under my eyes. I looked ugly. I looked sick. Mom said you look like a little ghost, Serafina continued, watching my face intently. She said she can't stand to look at you for too long. It's too upsetting. She cries in the car on the way home. Her words were little needles, each one finding a nerve. I didn't know then that my mother's tears were of worry, not revulsion. Serafina was reframing their concern as disgust. She was isolating me, making me feel like my illness was a repulsive burden. But don't worry, she'd added, patting my hand. I'll keep them company. I'm taking Mom to the spa tomorrow to cheer her up. And Dad and I are going to that movie you wanted to see. We have to keep their spirits up, you know. She wasn't comforting me. She was reporting on how my illness had become an opportunity for her. She was thriving in the space my sickness had created. I lay there, struggling to breathe, and I understood. My pain was her stage. My weakness was her strength. It was the first time I saw the cold, calculating machinery behind her beautiful eyes. That was the day the sister I thought I had died. The woman on the floor in the wedding dress was just the ghost that had been haunting me ever since. A vibration in my clutch pulled me from the memory. My phone screen lit up the darkness. The caller ID was simple, Father. For a long moment, I just watched it flash, his name. A word that was supposed to mean protection, stability, truth. He would be calling to rage, to demand an apology. 2. Command me to fix the mess I had made, as if I had spilled a glass of wine and not exposed a lifetime of rot. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. I needed to be the one to initiate, to control the final exchange. A minute later, a text message came through. A wall of furious, misspelled words. How could you? Your mother is distraught. You humiliated this family. You are a cruel, selfish girl. You've ruined everything. Call me now. There it was. Not a single question about my well-being. Not a flicker of concern for the daughter he thought was dying an hour ago. Just anger that I had upset the order of things. Anger that I had refused to die quietly. I took a deep breath. I dialed his number. He answered on the first half ring. Clara. He barked, his voice ragged with fury. You get back here right now. You will apologize to your sister, to Damien's family. No, I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through his tirade like a diamond. The silence on the other end was heavy with shock. I had never, not once in my life, said no to him. In that tone, what did you say? He whispered, his rage momentarily forgotten, replaced by disbelief. I said no. I repeated, my voice even. There will be no apologies. There will be no more conversations. You and Mother made a choice 5 years ago. You chose the beautiful lie over the ugly truth. You chose the daughter who told you what you wanted to hear over the one who told you what was real. We were worried. He protested, his voice cracking. We love you. We thought we were helping. We didn't know. He didn't want to know. I corrected him. It was easier this way. It was more dramatic. It made you the noble, suffering parents. You enjoyed the sympathy as much. As she did, I let that sit for a moment. So this is what you get. You get the story you chose. You can be the parents of the monstrous, lying daughter who bankrupted you and cheated on her husband. Or you can be the parents of the cruel, vengeful daughter who destroyed her sister's wedding. Either way, it's a tragedy. You love tragedies. A choked sob came from his end of the line. He was finally speechless, my portion of what's left of the equity in the house will be signed over to you, I said, my voice all business now. Consider it severance pay. Goodbye, Father. I didn't wait for a response. I ended the call, and then, with a strange sense of calm finality, I opened my contacts, found his name, and pressed block. I did the same for my mother, and for Serafina, a profound quiet settled over me. It was over. All of it. The ties were cut. The war was won. The silence I had craved for years was finally mine. I stood up from the bench and walked to the edge of the terrace. Below me, the lights of Manila stretched out to the horizon, a vast, glittering network of countless other lives, other stories, all moving and shifting in the warm Philippine night. I was just one small, anonymous light among them now. I had no family. I had no home to go back to. I had only myself, a substantial bank account, and a future that was a complete and utter blank, a blank I had fought for, a blank I had earned. For the first time since I was a child, no one was writing my story for me. I was finally, terrifyingly, beautifully free.